Hi everyone, I'm Kelsey from Just Sew and Storyhill Designs, and today I'm really excited to introduce to you my latest quilt pattern. This is called One Day Beginner Patchwork, and it is basically just like what the title says. It takes about 1 day to make. Me and all of my testers got it done in about 4 to 5 hours. It is beginner friendly and it's a simple patchwork quilt. So today I'm going to walk you through specifically those of you who are true beginners and might be using this pattern as your very first quilt. Hopefully this video will fill in a lot of gaps, some questions you might be having about the stages and steps of quilting, some suggested tools, as well as walking you through the pattern itself. In this video, I'm going to really break down all of the stages and steps of quilting. We're first going to talk about piecing your quilt top. Then we're going to talk about preparing your backing and your binding. And then at the end of the pattern and also in this video, I'm just going to give you a short explanation that will hopefully get you started on your understanding of batting, basting, different quilting methods, and different binding methods as well. So first let's talk about piecing. This is something that a lot of people don't understand about quilting, is that when you talk about I'm a quilter or I make quilts or something like that, the 3 stages of quilting are actually called piecing, quilting, binding. So when you talk about making a quilt, sometimes people don't understand what the piecing part really entails because only one of those steps is called quilting. So I'm gonna break that down for you in this video. So when you look at this quilt, it's made up of a bunch of different pieces of fabric, as you can see. We have a piece here, 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 and they're all sewn together. So the process of piecing is the process of cutting apart all of your fabric into different shapes and sizes according to a pattern, and then sewing them back together. That's kind of a joke that lots of quilters have, is my job is to cut apart perfectly fine pieces of fabric and then sew them back together in a weird design. So that is essentially what piecing is. And so typically when you buy a quilt pattern, it is the pattern of how to piece a quilt. And so if you're a beginner, you might buy a pattern and it might show you how to piece a quilt, but it doesn't really show you what happens after the piecing. And that's one thing that I really wanted to focus on in my beginner pattern, is the first half of it really talks about piecing the quilt top like a normal pattern does, but then the second half of the pattern really goes in depth into how to prepare your backing, your binding, and a different vocabulary and just kind of an explanation of things that beginners probably don't know about batting and quilting and things like that. So that's one of the things I really wanted to make sure is included in my 1 day beginner patchwork pattern, so that all of you beginners out there have most of your basic questions answered. So let's talk about the key elements of the piecing stage. I would say that the first one is picking out your material, choosing your fabrics, things like that. The second part would be cutting apart all of your fabric and labeling it according to the pattern. The third part would be sewing it together with an even seam allowance. That part is key. And the fourth part would be pressing, and sewing your pieces together and pressing kind of happens simultaneously. Let's talk about picking out your fabric. Now my pattern calls for either a layer cake or 11 third-yard cuts. So what that means is a layer cake is a type of pre-cut. This is what a layer cake looks like. A layer cake is 42 pieces of fabric that are cut into 10-inch squares. So my pattern specifically calls for either one of these packages, and all of the fabric is different in here, but they all coordinate. They're all from the same collection. So if it makes you nervous to pick out fabric and make sure they all coordinate, a layer cake is a great route to go because you know they all coordinate. They were designed to go together. So for my pattern, you can either use a layer cake or you can pick out your own fabric that coordinates. You'll need 1/3 yard cuts, which are 12-inch pieces. And what that is when you roll out a bolt at a fabric store, or if you're buying it online, the bolt is gonna be 45 inches long. So you're gonna get a 45-inch long strip of fabric times whatever width you purchase it by. So yardage is determined by the yard. So 1/3 of the yard is 12 inches. So 1/3 yard cut is 12 inches by 42 inches. So when it comes to picking them out, I wanted to show you kind of how I typically pick out my fabric when I'm picking and choosing different bolts. Typically, I will pick a focus fabric. I like to store my fabric on cardboard pieces, so that's what this is. So I'll choose a focus fabric, one that's kind of busy and has lots of colors that I really like. And then I'll go from there. So I noticed that there's like this minty green kind of color, so I'll pull in this green. And then I'll also notice that there's a magenta in here, so I pull in this dark pink. And then I really like the light pink hues, so I want more of a geometric print because we have lots of florals going on here, so I have a light pink gingham. And then I also really like the yellow that is in those leaves, so I pull in a yellow. So I just wanted to give you guys an example. These are just random fabrics from my stash of how I might go about pulling different fabrics for a project. I'll usually focus on 1 or 2 busy or colorful prints and then choose the rest of them based off of that. So that's a quick tip if you want to go the yardage route instead of the layer cake route. Included in my pattern are 2 different cutting instructions for how to cut your fabric depending on if you're using a layer cake or yardage. So don't worry, the pattern has you covered. Either way, whichever way you go, you'll be able to have diagrams to follow that show you how to cut out your fabric according to what you bought. Something that's important with quilting is there's lots of cutting involved, and so always make sure that you measure twice, cut once. And part of that is reading your entire pattern in its entirety before you get started. That way you might, if you see like, oh, I have a question over here in step 6 and I wouldn't have caught that when I was doing step 1, and so I can kind of figure that out mentally before I actually cut my fabric and get started. You kind of work through all those kinks ahead of time. So make sure you read the entire pattern and make sure it makes sense, and measure twice and cut once. You'll notice in a lot of patterns that there's usually a section that says like before we begin or read before starting or something like that. And that's typically important to read because that's the designer telling you how they envisioned you going about this pattern. So they might use abbreviations. Some common abbreviations are RST for right sides together. That talks about when you're putting the 2 right sides of your fabric together before sewing. You might have WST for wrong sides together. WOF stands for width of fabric, which typically in quilting will be that 45-inch long bolt. You might have HST for half square triangles if your pattern involves half square triangles. All kinds of things like that. So that's a really important section to always read no matter how experienced you are and no matter what pattern you're using. Another thing that I talk about in my before we begin section is the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Most of the time, I've really never seen a quilt pattern that calls for anything other than a 1/4 inch seam. If you're used to sewing other sewing projects or garments and things like that, then 1/4 inch seams are less common. You'll be working with a variation of seams, typically 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch. But with quilting, almost always, you're going to be working with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But it is good to just go ahead and double check that part of the pattern and make sure you have that right. I wanted to show you real quick how you can make sure you have a 1/4 inch seam. So right here you have your needle plate on your machine. It's typically the metal piece that's under your presser foot. And usually that has guided lines to follow. Sometimes it's also on your bobbin cover right here. Mine has markings on it to show the 1/4 inch seam on my bobbin cover. So some machines have that really clearly built in. But in addition to that, I also like to use either diagonal seam tape. This, you line this up so that the red line is along where your needle is, and then it's a 1/4 inch on either side. This helps you not only with your 1/4 inch seams, but also with blocks like half square triangles and flying geese units, which you won't need to do for this pattern, but this is something that's really nice to have on hand, and I just leave mine taped to my machine and I use it all the time. But my all-time favorite tool for making sure I always get a 1/4 inch seam is my 1/4 inch foot. So no matter what machine you have, your manufacturer probably does create, some machines will come with it, but if it didn't, then you can usually purchase a 1/4 inch foot for your machine. This has a guide right here and 1 hole for the needle to go in. So I know that if I line my fabric up with this guide and my needle is in that center hole, then my seam allowance will always be a 1/4 inch. Now that we've gotten through the before you begin section, usually next up you'll come to some form of a cutting chart. Like I said, in my pattern you'll have a cutting chart based off of layer cake squares and a cutting chart based off of your 1/3 of a yard cuts. So depending on what material you decided to buy, you'll follow the corresponding cutting instructions for that. I wanted to show you some key tools that you will need for cutting and quilting. So if this is your very first quilt, you might think that you would cut with scissors or templates or things like that, you could do that. But ever since the rotary cutter was invented, quilters pretty much across the board have adopted this as their main way of cutting fabric. It is such a time saver, and I really suggest it if you think that you'll make more than one quilt. I suggest investing in a cutting mat, a ruler, and a rotary cutter. So a cutting mat, I actually just got this one I'm really excited about. You will need to buy new ones occasionally because even if they're self-healing mats, you'll eventually cut on them so much that you'll wear out all of the cutting lines. So I just got a new one. So this just has all of my measurements across the bottom and the side, and grids, as well as diagonal lines for different degrees of cutting that I might need to do. And I do actually use those diagonal lines quite frequently. So this size mat is 24 by 18 inches, and that's just a really standard like at-home cutting mat size. If you have a really big table, you could invest in a 36 by 24 inch mat, but that's really big and I don't have space for that in my apartment. So I just use this little mat and it does the trick. The next thing that you're going to need is a ruler, and there are a million rulers to choose from and it can be very overwhelming. So I'm just gonna narrow it down for you. I have this square one, but honestly, I would say this is not a primary need. So if you're not sure how much quilting you're gonna be doing, save that one for later. I would suggest getting one of these. So my favorite brand of ruler is Creative Grid, but there's lots of standard ruler brands like Fiskars and Olfa and things like that that all make great rulers. You really just want to pay attention to the dimensions of the ruler for a ruler that you're starting out with. So this one is 12 and a half by 2.5 inches, and this one is 3.5 by 18 inches, I believe. Yes, 3.5 by 18 inches. So I have this one because that 18-inch length covers my entire cutting mat. And I have this one because when I'm cutting out smaller pieces, I might just want to use a smaller ruler. So if you have a mat that's my size, I would suggest getting one of these. And rulers really are crucial when you're using a rotary cutter. This is a rotary cutter. They also come in all types of brands and shapes and sizes. The standard size is a 45 millimeter. You do not need an 18, 28, or 60 millimeter. Just get a 45. You can get left-handed ones if you're left-handed. You can get ones with a handle like this, or you can get ones that just like have this straight handle. So what you're going to do is you line up your fabric straight on your cutting mat, and then you align your ruler with where you want to cut. You engage your blade and you press down on your ruler to make sure it doesn't budge, and you roll your blade right along that ruler, and that's what gives you your straight line cut when you're cutting a bunch of squares and rectangles like you will be in this pattern. So it's a much faster way of doing it than tracing and cutting with scissors, and it's also a lot more precise. Okay, and the last step of piecing that we're going to talk about is pressing. Pressing with an iron. So in my little setup over here, I have a wool mat right next to me at all times and a mini travel iron. I use these mostly for when I'm sewing little pieces of fabric together and I can iron it, because you iron in between every step basically. So it's right next to me, I can just iron real quick. But if you don't want to invest in a wool mat and a mini iron right off the bat, I don't blame you. Just get a regular, I have a plain ironing board right in front of me and a standard size iron. You will want those handy though, because you'll be ironing in between every seam that you sew. So another thing to pay attention to in the before we begin section of my pattern is I tell you that the direction that the arrows are facing are the direction that you should press your seams in. So make sure that when you are done sewing two pieces together, you open them up and then you press. Alright, so I also like to use a smoothing spray when I iron. This specific brand is called Flatter. It is not a starch. You could use a starch, but I just really like using the Flatter spray because it helps all of my creases really set, my seams really set, and it also gets all the creases out of the fabric when I'm trying to iron it off the bolt. So that is one thing that I really like to have. And then obviously an iron that can steam iron. So I wanted to show you this. There's two different ways you can iron. You could iron your seams open, or you could iron them to one side. So here's my seam and they're ironed to this side. So this one is not ironed yet. And you can see how flat this is compared to this one that's not yet ironed. You want to iron between every single seam that you do before you move on to the next one. Some people don't realize that in quilting, ironing is just as important as sewing sometimes. So I just wanted to show you what I do. I do it from the wrong side. Some people do it from the right side. It's up to you. But what you really do not want is, well, let me just do it the wrong way and then you'll see what I mean. You don't want to do it so that when you have ironed your seam right here, you could still pull it tauter, because this means you're going to accidentally iron a crease in here and it's not actually all the way to where your stitches are. So you really do not want that. So to prevent that, what I do is from the wrong side, put my iron down over here. I'm gonna move it this way. So I gently pull this side to make it taut. Just make sure I really only sew it, or only iron it right to where my stitches are, so there's not that overlapping flap, if that makes sense. So follow the direction of the arrows in the pattern. If it tells you to iron it to the left, then that's what it means. It means to iron your seam over to the left, like that. Okay, so that's all my basic information about piecing. I hope that was helpful. This video is just meant to be like an overview. I do hope to make more in-depth videos in the future, but this one is just to get you started on this pattern. So let's move on to the second part of the pattern. That first part was the piecing about how to make your quilt top. But you might notice that a quilt that's just very one-dimensional like this, first of all, has all these raw edges on this one side and it's not very comfortable, so there's still two major steps left to do. So let's talk about your backing fabric. This pattern assumes you're using 45-inch wide fabric and you're going to need to piece it. So there is a page on how to piece your backing. If you decide to go the route of a wider backing, which would be typically 60 inches wide or 108 inches wide, then you probably won't need to piece your backing. So this is just assuming that you're using a 45-inch wide bolt, because obviously this quilt is bigger than 45 inches on both sides are bigger than 45 inches. So you'll need to piece two 45-inch wide pieces together in order to get your backing wide enough. So pay attention to how wide your backing fabric is. And you also want to make sure in this quilt, it's built into the dimensions of the backing that it calls for, but not in every pattern. So in future patterns that you do, make sure that it's telling you to get enough backing so that you have 6 to 8 inches extra in length and width. Meaning if your quilt is 60 by 50 inches, your backing should be 68 by 58 inches, give or take a few. But this is so that your backing is bigger than your top. You also want your batting to be bigger than your top, and it makes quilting much easier. You want it to be larger than your top whether you're quilting it yourself or you're sending it off to a long arm quilter. So that's an important math thing to do to figure out how much backing you need. Always make sure you have extra. And again, if you're using 45-inch wide fabric, you'll need to piece it. And a couple piecing tips that I have are to make sure you cut off your selvages. Your selvages are the edges of the fabric off the bolt. So usually there's like a white strip on one side and on the other side it'll just be kind of frayed. Cut off both of those sides and sew along that, what used to be the selvage. And I also suggest using a wider seam allowance, about 1/2 inch. Definitely nothing smaller than 1/4. 1/4 to 1/2 inch would be great for your backing piecing. The pattern also includes instructions on how to cut your binding. I'm not going to talk in depth about binding in this video because I do have an entire binding series that I have linked in the description box below. So make sure you go check out that binding series if you have any questions. But the pattern does include a page on how to cut and prepare your binding, and then you can go find tutorials for how to bind your quilt that would be comfortable for you. Okay, and the last part of the pattern is notes about batting, basting, quilting, and binding. And my purpose behind writing this was so that a lot of your basic beginner questions could be answered about things that other experienced quilters probably wouldn't include in their patterns because they're expecting their quilters to already know the answers. But I know that when I was first starting out, it was kind of frustrating to me when people would just assume that I knew what batting to buy or that I knew what a 1/4 inch seam allowance meant and things like that. And so I wanted to make sure that I really broke it down for you. So even if you already know some of this information, I hope that the other half that you don't know is helpful on your quilting. So the first thing that section talks about is batting. Now, it does talk a little bit about batting, and I have my recommendation of where to start out with an 80-20 blend. But if you want to do more research into different types of batting and you really want to learn a lot more about it, then in the description of this video, I have linked a document where I took notes from watching someone who works for the batting company Hobbs talk about batting in general, and then Hobbs brand batting. Hobbs is my personal favorite. And I took a bunch of notes because it was like a 2-hour long video, so I broke it down into these like 2 or 3 pages for you guys. So if you're interested in reading that, I'll put the link to it in the description below so that you can have a quick reference guide about any basic questions you might have about batting. The next thing I talk about is basting. Honestly, basting is one of my least favorite things about quilting. I hate basting. Even with just small projects like quilted bags and things like that, the basting part is definitely my least favorite. And so it's one of the biggest reasons I like long arm quilting is that you don't need to baste your quilt if you're sending it to a long armer. I personally do the long arm quilting, but once it's on the machine, the basting is so much easier than it is doing it at home. So not to be discouraging, it's just something that I don't do very often, and so I can't speak super authoritatively on it, but I will show you 2 of the 3 examples that I talk about in the pattern. In the pattern, I talk about how you can use spray basting, which is like, comes in a can like this. It looks kind of like spray paint or something. It's a spray adhesive, so you would lay out your backing wrong side up, spray it, lay down your batting, spray it, and then lay your top on top, and hopefully it keeps it all in place. So this one is just called Quilt Basting Spray. There's another brand that's really popular called 505 Basting Spray. You might also want to use pins. I would suggest using safety pins if you do that, not like regular straight pins. But there's also this brand, Clover makes Wonder Pins, which are a little bit easier. They're specifically made for quilt basting, and they're colorful, so they're easy to see, and they're really easy to do with one hand, where safety pins are a little harder. And then other than that, you could baste it using long stitches, either by hand or on your machine. But again, none of these options are like my absolute favorite. I would say if you're really wanting to quilt this quilt yourself and learn more about basting, I would suggest watching the videos of someone who does it more often, because honestly, most of my quilts go through the long arm. Which brings me to long arm quilting. So I myself am a long arm quilter. I have a long arm. I do it for customers and I do it for all of my own quilts. So if you have any questions about long arm quilting, feel free to reach out to me via email, quilts@justsewstudio.com. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Other than that, just read all the information I have provided in the pattern and any of the videos I put out here on YouTube regarding long arm quilting. And then the final thing I talk about is binding. So like I said, I'm not going to go super in depth in this video because I have a whole video series on binding. I will say that the one video I haven't made yet for binding is finishing your quilt binding by machine. And that's because I've done a lot of trial and error of different methods of machine binding. And I'm finally starting to hone in on one that I actually like. But before, I was an avid hand binder. Like all of my quilts did hand binding. But hand binding does take a lot longer, and so my stack of quilts that need to be bound just kept getting higher. And so finally I bit the bullet and I have been learning how to do it by machine, and I've been tweaking it every time to try to find a method that I'm really satisfied in. So I'm waiting to make that video until I'm really happy with the outcome of my machine binding, but I am getting closer, so keep an eye out for that video in the future. It might be up right now when you're watching this, I don't know. You can go look at my quilt binding playlist on my YouTube channel and see if I have that out yet. But right now, as I'm filming this, I have how to prep your binding, how to finish it by hand. I also have how to make continuous bias binding, and also how to bind the edges of a hexagon quilt if you want those points and stuff like that. So This quilt is just a regular, very straightforward, standard quilt binding, nothing very special about it. So hopefully those videos will help you be confident in your binding skills as you bind your very first quilt. Okay guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video of me helping you along with some of your beginner questions and also explaining a little bit more about my quilt pattern. My pattern is available in the link in the description box below on my website, justsewstudio.com. Please keep in touch with me and let me know when you finish your quilts. You can tag me at storyhilldesigns or at justsewstudio on Instagram. I'd love to see your finished quilts. You can also join my Facebook group called Just Sew Along, where you can post pictures of all of your finished projects. Especially if you're a newbie though, I do suggest joining that group so you can be encouraged by the other quilters and also ask lots of your questions in that Facebook group. I really have a heart for beginner quilters and I don't want you to feel left behind. So if you have any suggestions on future videos for me to make targeted toward beginners, please comment that down below and I will be sure to listen to all of your comments and suggestions. Thank you so much for buying my new pattern. I hope it helps you out and I can't wait to see your finished project. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for all of my future videos. Bye!